Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Mike Vera, who is a board-certified health coach holding a Master's of Science degree specialized in sports psychology, performance enhancement, and injury prevention. As the founder of Red Pill Health and Wellness, he is dedicated to debunking health myths and empowering individuals with scientifically accurate information. Mike Vera, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Mike, will cover health myths and propaganda. But before we get into these topics, could we start by getting your overall assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, your comment on the times in which we live?
Yeah, I think probably the best term to start with this answer is fifth generation warfare. Conventionally, when you think about warfare, most people would imagine two opposing groups of people shooting guns at each other, and that's definitely been true. But today we find ourselves in a landscape where warfare has an element of deception to it that carries over into the civilian life. And it's something that involves an attack on our cognition through information warfare like propaganda. And of course, that's something that can lead us to making decisions that might not be in our best interest, that might be in the best interest of the propagators, of the propagandists, of the people who are putting out that information to shape our opinions and our behaviors. So I see it as very important to start from a place of recognition, of realizing that the world is not exactly how it seems. And once we realize that and accept it, we can start to navigate the landscape accordingly.
Nice. The mission of the Information Professionals Association is to bring together a diverse group of people who are thinking about these kinds of problems that you're just articulating there, Mike. And it's super easy, IPA's DNA, if you will, or our founding team very much has a national security heritage, but it's a much bigger problem than just the national security community. It's a societal challenge, and so having people like you into this forum who are coming from a different vantage is a really important part of the IPA project. And so thanks for what you're doing with your podcast and with your business, and looking forward to unpacking that a little bit more. Maybe we can start with the name of your business. It's Red Pill Health and Wellness. Do you think maybe for those in our audience that might be unfamiliar with the red pill concept, you could explain that, and also maybe use that to help describe what got you interested in health-related disinformation in the first place?
Sure. So I have two answers for that. Red pill is a term that has been popularized by the movie The Matrix. So if anybody has seen that, they know there's a scene in the movie where the main character, Neo, is offered a choice between two pills. The blue pill basically puts him back to sleep and he lives in a false reality. And the red pill wakes him up to the truth of the real world that he's in. And to be honest, I think the movie The Matrix has done more of a disservice than anything, because it's hard to talk about the idea of a matrix. A matrix is a technical term. It's a very real thing, meaning like a part of your environment. And unfortunately, nowadays, when people hear that word, the matrix, it's kind of written off as like a conspiracy theory because you're talking about the movie. It's easy to dismiss. But nonetheless, the term red pill is a colloquial term in society referring to this idea of waking people up. And so I feel like it's the perfect analogy to talk about what my mission is. And it's not just to talk to people who maybe are already awake, but it's actually to wake people up. And I mean to help restore their full consciousness, because a lot of people operate on a type of autopilot where they're not making conscious decisions. They're kind of just reacting to the signals in their environment, and that can be a problem. That's how propaganda can be effective. So when I say red pill, the idea is to wake people up to these sorts of things. But what really got me interested in this sort of these sorts of topics would be at 13 years old. George Carlin, I heard him on Napster. He's a stand-up comedian.
Mm-hmm.
And in his later years, he was saying things like challenge authority, question everything you read, be skeptical. And as a 13-year-old kid, I wasn't hearing stuff like that before. All I was hearing in the school system from my parents, from everywhere else, is trust authority, just go with the flow, behave. And George Carlin was telling me the opposite of that. And I'm not telling people to misbehave, but it definitely struck something in me that really stuck with me through everything I did for the rest of my life. That never went away. And
Mm-hmm.
the deeper that sort of instilled in my mentality, the more I could see manipulation and influence efforts from everywhere, from political propaganda to marketing and advertising to just your average person, maybe peer pressuring. So I could just see it everywhere. And, it really shaped how I looked at the world still. And it upsets me when some people fail to see that in any degree at all. And it really leaves them vulnerable. So I think it's very important to talk about.
I see. Yeah. I vividly remember I might have been in like sixth grade or seventh grade or something like this. And my science teacher, uh, I believe that this was like at the very beginning of the semester. This was like day one, class one of this particular class. And this lady, got up in front of the class and said, "Hey, this is going to be." Oh, maybe it was like a like science chemistry type thing. Anyway, she's like, "Hey, kids, this is going to be a great class. I'm really looking forward to it. Let me just show you the kind of thing that we're going to be, doing here." And she said, "Here, I've got." I've got a flask here with like it's just got some water in it, and I've got this over here, and I'm gonna mix these things together. And as she mixed the two items together into what was water, right? It like turned the water like bright purple or something like that, which was it just like impossible. But her point was, she looks at the class and says something like, "Oh, I see a bunch of surprised looks on your faces. Why is that?" And they're like, "But yeah, how can water do that?" And it's like, "Well, it turns out it's not water. It was some kind of like alcohol solution or something like that." But her point was, I think, a similar point to what you were just making, Mike. It's like, be skeptical. Don't take everything that you hear and see for granted. And it's a lesson that really stuck with me, and it was delivered in a really helpful way. But that's the kind of thing also that I've thought about, like if I were in front of a classroom of fourth graders or a classroom of eighth graders, what is like the big takeaway that you could give those youngsters, relevant to all of this? And my big takeaway that I would give to kids is something like, you need to understand that you are being influenced constantly. And some of that influence is like typical, normal, like commercials for products and stuff like that, things that are like overt, but you are also being influenced in ways that you just don't understand and that, are very hard to detect. And you just need to be aware of that. And I think that probably resonates with the kinds of things that you pass along to the people you engage with as well.
Absolutely. And you use a cool example how a scientific experiment can be used to, very ethically demonstrate the manipulation that can take place. And you see the same sorts of things in magic, for instance, like
Mm,
actual magicians doing magic trick. They're influencing you, they're manipulating you to think one thing is happening while they're using sleight of hand or some sort of trickery to lead you to a surprised result and the involuntary reaction of the surprise. And so, Propaganda is just like a magic trick because it does involve an element of deception. But similarly, once you see how the trick is done, it doesn't have that same impact. You can't be surprised or fooled again. So whether we're talking about magic or a science experiment or propaganda, there is something to having a scrutinizing eye and being able to see the manipulation that might be taking place, so that not only you can defend yourself against the manipulation, but you can actually use it for your own benefit. You can use those tools and tactics to set yourself up for success.
Right. Maybe you could describe, Mike, some of the real world impacts of health related falsehoods that you've encountered or that you try to teach people.
Yeah, well, the biggest thing is poor health. Especially you look in the United States, where are all the healthy people? You see chronic disease on the rise, obesity on the rise. Basically, every illness or unhealthy possible category is on the rise. And part of that is because of the information in our environment. As any health coach will talk to people about their environment and the signals that it's sending. So if we're talking about changing your diet, okay, what does your home look like? What signals is your home sending you? Do you have cookies visible? Do you have ice cream ready to go? That's your environment, and those are signals that are being sent to you. And weight loss or exercise, what signals is your environment telling you there? Is your house so comfortable? Is your life so comfortable that it makes it tough to go into challenge? And are there obstacles to getting to the gym and all these sorts of things? And my point here is that we often fail to pay attention to the information in our environment. We open up our phones, we turn on our TVs, and we just invite all of these influential messages into our lives, really without much thought about how it might be affecting us. And often the things that we don't think about in terms of affecting us sometimes have a dramatic impact. So I think this creates prime opportunity for people to make poor decisions about health, to be misled about health. And especially, you look at the past few years, what has happened with the whole controversial health event that has happened over the past few years. You have people wearing masks and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And it certainly caused a lot of confusion and mayhem, distrust, and all this chaos really around health. And there's information coming at you from every angle. So I think that is really a key to health. As weird as it sounds, propaganda being a key to health. I think almost nobody would say that, but I'm here to say exactly that.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure this is not limited to health related marketing, but health related marketing, it seems to me, is like notorious for I don't know, falsehoods or sensationalized claims. I don't know. I'm thinking of stuff like 100 years ago or 150 years ago with magic elixirs which will cure aches and pains and all this kind of stuff, all the way through to today. So I mean, what are some of the themes, I guess, or the typical tactics that you've uncovered that are can be kind of described as, I don't know, either unethical health marketing or take that in whatever direction you think is productive.
Yeah, I think one thing that people need to realize when it comes to science of any kind is that science comes down ultimately to an argument. So with a scientific study or research, you have a paper that lays out some pretty non-negotiable things. So it lays out the goal. It lays out the instruments used. It lays out the method. It lays out the data and the methods used to interpret the data. But then at the end, it gets to a point where you get to the interpretation of the results, the interpretation of the data. And that's really the scientists or the researchers making an argument about what they found. Sometimes the argument isn't always right. Sometimes the argument doesn't tell the full story. Sometimes the argument is driven by potential conflicts of interest. So here's an example. You talked about health marketing even 100 years ago with snake oil and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah.
You're seeing questionable arguments being made in the space today. There seems to be a push for eating bugs, which is almost a silly thing to talk about, but you do see tons of articles saying that this is the new path moving forward. It has protein, it's good for your health. It has omegas, it's good for your health. But if you were to examine this closer, just because something has a nutritional profile doesn't mean that it's good for your health, right? There are plenty of things with protein or omegas that might not be good for your health.
Mm.
So then you start to look a little deeper and you find that there's an ingredient, or really a component of the exoskeleton of bugs called chitin that is non-digestible to humans. So that's an entire argument that's left out of this conversation around the push for eating bugs is, well,
Oh, is that right?
okay, yeah, if you want to talk about protein and omegas, but what about the fact that these things are not easily digestible? They can contribute to gut permeability and
Mm.
all sorts of gut inflammation, and I could go on and on. So then, where's the financial drive coming from this? Because there's no demand. We live in a supply demand economy. Where's the demand for eating bugs? So, there's certainly some red flags when you look at things like that.
Yeah, this is fascinating stuff, Mike. What have you discovered, or what is your take on how social media influences or affects these kinds of dynamics? And I'm thinking about things such as like the psychology of crowds or the spread of misinformation. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, so social media is so interesting because historically you look at crowd psychology and you have to be physically in an area with somebody for that to constitute a crowd. And
Mm.
there's plenty of research and work on this. You look at The Crowd Mind is a great book by Gustave Le Bon, who goes into the intricacies of the crowd mind and how it's kind of separate from the individual mind. And one of the implications of that is something called de-individuation, which is a separation from your individual consciousness, where it puts you into a sort of collective conscious state where you're very reactive. You're not using your prefrontal cortex as much and making critical thoughts. You're kind of going with the flow. This is why you hear some people call other people sheep. Now, I'm not condoning that. That's maybe a little mean, but that's the sort of thing that they're talking about, is de-individuation. And with the technical landscape that we find ourselves in, social media has created this opportunity for people to be in a crowd in a digital space. So you don't even have to be physically in the same space anymore. And that can be good and bad, right? So you can form a community of positive, like-minded people. That's great. But it also could contribute to this de-individuation, which puts people into this less cognitive state, and it makes them more reactive. It makes them more vulnerable, more easy to put forth something like ideological subversion. Because when you have a strong sense of identity and individuality, it's very tough for people to really subvert your own ideologies and attack the ideas that you hold strong. But when you find yourself as part of this collective group, well, you've kind of sacrificed elements of your individuality. And that's why when you look at something like ideological subversion, as Yuri Bezmenov talked about from the former KGB, you kind of need the individuation to be able to uh, subvert people in that way. So social media has its benefits, but it also has some big areas of concern when you think about the propagation of potentially dangerous information.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting concept of it's kind of challenging to say, de-individuation.
Mm.
But yeah, I think of that as like a perhaps a necessary but insufficient step in some kinds of like herding and forcing kind of flows, right? And I mean, there's been plenty of times in my life when I've been in a crowd of people and I'm literally like going with the flow. You can think of it as like having like fluid dynamic properties, being in a crowd, like at a big college football game or at a concert, and you're exiting and whatnot. You're kind of in the flow, and it's not like it's a dangerous situation at that very moment, but there is a bit of a helplessness to it in that you're going to have a hard time either getting out of the flow or going in a different direction. And there really is an analogy with social media dynamics, or we were talking before to our audience, talking before we got started here. And for me, I mean, I'll just admit my own, some of the own experiences that I've had. It's super easy to just lose an hour going down some kind of a social media rabbit hole, especially with these engaging little short videos, which have become, so popular on so many platforms these days. And all of a sudden, where did that 30 minutes go? But back to the de-individuation and just going with the flow, it's really easy just to kind of watch whatever video comes up next, uncritically. And something that I've started doing is especially with these short channels. So like I've this is a long sidebar here. Bear with me, Mike. There's a
You're good.
question. There's a question in here somewhere. But so I've watched YouTube videos now for at least 10 years, and these little engaging short videos have only been around for maybe a year. But but with the typical YouTube video and channels, I have not typically subscribed or unsubscribed or blocked certain channels just because I haven't found it to be especially necessary, because I typically choose the video that I'm going to watch, and I consciously choose it. But these little shorts, again, getting back into the flow, it's really easy just to flow and just watch the next one and watch the next one. But here just recently, I have consciously started like telling YouTube, don't show me this anymore, or disengage from this particular channel, because they're serving up content to me that they think that I should like. And occasionally it becomes pretty obvious to me that YouTube is serving up content to me, based upon my age and all that kind of stuff. Like, hey, other men in their mid 50s like this kind of content. What do you think? And it's like, I mean, not to get too graphic or anything, but it might be something that's a little bit more sexual or titillating or something. And I will, very quickly now just like swipe off of it so that the algorithm doesn't think that that's the kind of thing that interests me. Or I will actually say, don't show this channel to me anymore, because if this channel has this kind of content, then forget it. It's not worth my time. And nor do I want the algorithm to serve up that kind of content to me going forward. So anyway, there's a question in there somewhere that maps back to being in the flow and being influenced.
Yeah, I think there's actually a dichotomy there, because on one hand, you do want to be careful about the information that you consume, because it's like food, right? You're eating food. You want to be careful about the food that you eat. Well, you're also consuming media. You want to be careful about that. And the same way I would tell one of my clients, maybe it's not best to surround yourself with toxic people. Well, it's also not the best to surround yourself with toxic ideas. So if you come across something that's particularly egregious, you probably want to eliminate that from your feed. At the same time, and this is where the dichotomy comes in, on the other hand, you also don't want to nerf your life. So you don't want to stumble into an echo chamber or create echo chambers for yourself. And this is more along the lines of things that you disagree with, especially like politics or whatever. If you encounter information that you're just like, oh, I don't agree with that, or I don't like this person because he said something I don't agree with, I'm going to eliminate them from my feed. I understand that, and that's totally up to you. But at the same time, you might just be creating a very cushy environment for yourself where it's only things that you agree with. And then next thing you know, you're basically contributing to mental fragility, and you're making yourself weak in terms of being able to encounter things that you don't like or you don't disagree with or that you don't agree with And that's not very productive. It's not conducive to strength. It's not even conducive to getting by in the chaotic, disagreeable world that we live in. So there is, it's up to the individual to figure out what do I want in front of me and what don't I? And the digital space is maybe a little more complex because it's pretty straightforward when we try to figure out what we want in our homes or not. But, many of us spend more time in the social media space than we even do mentally in our physical environment. So it's really something to put a lot of thought into.
Yeah, I really appreciate your health perspective on this, like personal, mental, physical health perspective. So what are some of the strategies that you've either developed or learned to counter some of these tendencies, or ways of countering these influence techniques?
So there's a few. One of them that is a favorite of the people that I work with is basically self-indoctrination. So, you look at something like the Pledge of Allegiance. Technically, that's a type of indoctrination. I have no problem with that. I'm not trying to be negative or challenge that in any way. I think indoctrination, you look at it technically by definition, it's, going along with a doctrine and trying to instill that into somebody in some way. And so obviously there's a strong case for the Pledge of Allegiance being a very positive thing, contributing to patriotism in this beautiful country of ours. It's great. We can also do the same thing for ourselves. We can recognize the values that we have, what really we want to abide by as individuals. Many of us fail to think about that at all. But what do we stand for? And we can create our own type of Pledge of Allegiance to our own values. And we can recite this every morning or however we see fit, every Sunday, whatever the individual wants to do is, a type of self-indoctrination process. And there's other ways to do that. It doesn't have to be, reciting a pledge. Because indoctrination, there's a lot of different components to that, right? It's the clothes you wear, it's rituals that you might have. So creating some kind of process to remind yourself of the values that you hold dear and that you want to carry with you. Other than that would be controlling your environment. And that's kind of a general open thing. So I'll be more specific. Something called standard operating procedures.
Love it.
I could talk about that for days, but the most concise way I think to say that would be SOPs, standard operating procedures, is basically making decisions ahead of time of how you want to behave. So you eliminate the thought from it. It actually eliminates the possibility of being influenced if you've already decided and determined how you're going to act and behave. So if you wake up, and let me actually say this first. Most of us already abide by a set of standard operating procedures, both in our personal life and our work life. So when you go to work, you are already following the SOPs that have already been set for you by somebody else. So you're committing to SOPs, you're getting paid for it, you're doing the work for somebody else. But then many people come home and they tune out and they fail to implement some kind of SOP for themselves that really brings them further away from their goals. Meaning, if they were to implement even the simplest of standard operating procedures for their own personal life, they would move closer to their goals every day, whatever those goals are. So on a personal level, we already have SOPs. We already have routines, whether we realize it or not. Whatever you do in the morning consistently is your morning routine. So it would benefit a lot of people to do that self-reflection and figure out, what am I doing already? Because a lot of us don't think about that. But what am I doing already? How can I create a set of standard operating procedures so that I behave in a way that's more conducive to the goals that I want to accomplish? And like I said, there is so much that. That's really what I spend most of my time helping people with that I work with. And it's different for everybody. That's the thing. I can go on, but I'll probably stop there because I can really get carried away with this.
Yeah, no, you are really speaking my language there as far as like understand. So what you were describing there, the national security community might also think about as patterns of life, and if bad actors or understanding patterns of life is a useful technique across all kinds of domains of interest. And if you can model and objectively understand what the typical behaviors are, the emerging trends, when someone does this, there's a 60% likelihood they're going to do this next, and then there's a 40% likelihood they're going to do this next. This gets into that kind of like that herding and forcing kinds of functions in order to channel somebody or channel a society or channel an organization down some kind of a pathway towards a targetable activity. And by targetable, I don't mean dropping a bomb on them. I mean, delivering something to them that's going to help advance your goals. Being cognizant of that. What I'm hearing you saying is being cognizant of your SOPs and having some deliberateness about how you go about your daily life is a way of potentially minimizing the likelihood of being influenced in ways that would be detrimental to your health. Would you say that there's something to what I was just describing there?
1,000%. And here's an example, because I think some people might hear that and they might go like, I don't know. I don't believe that. I'm not influenced, right? Because when we're influenced, we don't exactly feel often like we've been influenced. But here's something I hear all the time from people I work with. I went into Target to buy 2 things and I walked out and I bought 10 things. How could this happen? It's because you were influenced. That's not an accident. There are people who gather around in rooms and say, hey, how can we influence these people to buy more things? And it works. And these people, they go in with the intention of buying maybe 2 things, and then their buttons are pushed and their strings are pulled, and they look at the packaging and the slogans and the colors and the music that's playing and the lighting and all these different things that are not set up accidentally. They spend millions of dollars trying to make it very deliberate how everything is placed perfectly in that store, and it works. And we spend way more money than we intend to. And that's a perfect example of how the average civilian is influenced in ways that they might not even realize when it's happening. And that's important to realize because it happens beyond Target. It happens all the time. It happens in almost every facet of life. And the sooner we can recognize that, the sooner we can take control of our health.
Yeah, we had a really interesting previous episode. I haven't brought this up in a while, but it maps onto what you were just describing there, Mike, with a fella named Denver Dill, who I don't know whether he's retired from the Army yet or not, but this was about a year ago. But he is an instructor at West Point, and his MOS in the Army, I'm going to not get this quite right, but basically he is a musician in the Army, and he is teaching West Point cadets and also some of their graduate students as well the power of music and how music can be used in influence operations. And so yeah, during the I'll have a link to it in the show notes, but he describes the Disney experience and how when people come into Disneyland or Disney World, it's like they are entering a whole new experience, and there's music and sights and sounds, and it's all part of it. And it's not about, well, I mean, maybe with Disney, it is about, partially about, having people, spend more money at their parks, but, set that aside for just a moment. It's also about the experience, and, you're doing something different. You're not going, you're not, going on a walk, or you're not going to the movie. You're going to Disney, right? And it's a transformational kind of a thing, and that's kind of what you were just describing with a shopping experience as well.
Yeah, imagine the silliness of, just for contrast, if Disney were to play like heavy metal, Cradle of Filth, or some like obviously
Okay, yeah,
different, people would obviously notice that. It would change their experience. And I don't think they're going to do that anytime soon, but it does highlight the effectiveness of music and the power that it can really have on influencing how we feel.
Yeah, right. I'm putting a link in the show notes. It's episode number 91, Denver Dill on the arts. So interested listeners can go and check that out. Wow, man. Well, I tell you what, Mike, this has been a fascinating discussion. Really interesting space that you're working in here with your clients. Important, obviously. Um, I'd like to close out if we may. So we've got a lot of students and researchers who listen to this podcast. What kind of a fruitful research question might you suggest to somebody who wants to investigate some of this stuff further and contribute to the body of knowledge?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts there because on one hand, it would be interesting to see some experimental research in the crowd psychology space, basically looking at the mechanisms of de-individuation and the implications of that. But I've worked with the IRB. I've done cognitive psychology research. I know how difficult it would probably be to get something like that passed by the Institutional Review Board, the IRB. And even funnier is that I think those are the types of research that you would imagine that the intelligence agencies are doing in a covert way. I'm sure they are on some level. But more practically speaking, it seems relevant, some research on AI and the ability to influence people's opinions towards incorrect ideas. And this would be pretty straightforward to set up because nowadays AI programs can be constructed to do very specific tasks. So a research team could construct an AI bot where you would have two groups. You have the control group that just interacts with an AI bot that tells the truth. Then you have another AI bot in the experimental group that talks about, that converges and talks or not converges, but converses with the participant and misleads them in some programmed way. So, the details of that study would have to be worked out. What are they trying to mislead them about? But I'd be curious to see how effective an AI would be in getting people to change their minds on topics or ideas that they hold deeply, like some serious, close to your personal identity type ideas, like political ideology, for instance. Can we get AI to manipulate people into changing their political ideologies? Because I would imagine that there are governments out there already, when we talk about national security and you think about propaganda, I'm sure there are AI and bot efforts already trying to do these sorts of things on people. I mean, you go back to the Russian interference controversy from the past few years. That's exactly the sort of thing they're talking about. So I think it would be neat to see the actual effectiveness on a scientific level, especially as AI continues to grow and develop and become smarter and stronger every day.
Okay, yeah, excellent suggestion. And then finally, you gave a shout out to a book by Gustave Le Bon a few moments ago. We'll have a link to that. But are there any other books or online resources that are some of your go-to materials for understanding these kinds of dynamics better?
Yeah, I have three other book suggestions. Anything
Okay.
by Edward Bernays is great.
Ah, yeah.
Edward Bernays is the father of modern propaganda and public relations. And so it's really interesting. We could debate for hours about the difference between something like marketing and propaganda, like political propaganda. There's a lot to be said about that, but ultimately they accomplish the same things. They use the same tools and tactics. It's to gather and propagate information in a coordinated way to influence the perceptions or behaviors of a targeted group of people. And Edward Bernays has done that both in a public relations capacity and a propaganda capacity. So that's really where I think a lot of people can learn on a deep level the way that these sorts of things are carried out. But in terms of health, there's a good book called The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg that will give you a good look into the mechanisms that drive your habits and inclinations. It will really help you understand what drives you currently. And the book that you should read immediately after that is called Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. And that might seem odd or out of place, but the reason I recommend reading that after habits is because habit focuses on the internal, whereas Checklist Manifesto focuses on the actual application and the externalization of those sorts of things that you would have learned in the habits book. So it allows you to more easily create the standard operating procedures that I talked about earlier in this episode, so that you can really build a system that works for you, so that you can constantly influence yourself instead of allow yourself to be influenced by others.
Excellent suggestions, Mike. Really appreciate it. And with that, Mike Vera, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks so much, John. It's great to be here.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.